on the table over about Selkirk, heading northwest. And I was a bit dubious about this, and I phoned up the observer corps. I said, "What's this hostile you've got?" Well, they said, "It's a 110, Messerschmitt 110. I said, "Well, you better tell them to have another look, because it hasn't enough petrol to get back to Germany." So, as it turned out, of course, it was a 110, and he wasn't interested in going back to Germany. So I sent off, I had a couple of night fighters, Defiants, up practicing. So I put them over Kilmarnock, which was where the chap was heading. And apparently they never saw him, but Hess saw them. And he thought they were hurricanes. And that's what precipitated his either landing or parachuting or whatever he did.
What had been the true meaning of the Deputy Führer's flight to Scotland? Had it been as was stated, that knowing of Hitler's plans for a war on two fronts, to which he was bitterly opposed, his mission had been to sue for peace with the British government? Or was he, as the official statement issued from Berlin had maintained, suffering from hallucinations? An urgent telephone call from Göring to fighter leader Adolf Galland on that day perhaps relays the true feelings of the German High Command. Galland had been told that the Deputy Führer had gone mad and was flying to England in a stolen Messerschmitt 110, and that he must be shot down at all costs. The German Air Force, like the British, failed to contact Hess's aircraft. Out of fuel, it came down on farmland near Eaglesham, 20 miles from its pilot's objective, the Duke of Hamilton's estate at Dungavel. Hess had landed safely by parachute and quickly surrendered himself to the nearest civilian. For Rudolf Hess, the war was over. His futile peace proposals rejected, he would spend the remainder of his life in captivity. Flight Lieutenant Al Deer had also been in the air in search of the elusive 110. Narrowly missing an interception with the aircraft, one wonders now what course history would have taken had Hess been shot down and killed that night. However, 1941 also saw the squadron transferred to Kenley, a move they had waited for, as they could now join the many other squadrons involved in the offensive sweeps into France. A paragraph in this newspaper report made light of the fact that 602's trophies had been left in Glasgow. That much was true, but not their fighting spirit. That would now take them on into France. One of those pilots with that spirit was Glenn Niven, who had rejoined 602 at West Hampnet at the close of the Battle of Britain, narrowly missing becoming a casualty himself, as a 109's cannon shell ripped away part of his port wing. Glenn now recalls the early days of the offensive into France and one pilot and friend who sadly didn't come back.
Glyn Ritchie.
Yes.
And I'd had a night out in London and came back and was met. He'd been in the squadron for a year. That Glyn was killed. You think, oh God, poor Glyn, but he was a damn good pilot, sort of thing. I don't know, you were young, you just sort of, that was it, all right, where are we going to get boozed up tonight? I'm afraid there wasn't that sort of, poor bugger. I think the main thing was, it's not going to happen to me.
Niven's words may seem cold and uncaring now, but that's how it was in 1941. Even though they all felt the loss of pilots and friends deeply, they could never show it. There wasn't time. There was a job to get on with. That job was to be made easier with the long-awaited arrival of the Mark 5B Spitfire. With its increased power output and, most importantly, its two 20mm cannons, 602 Squadron would at last be on equal terms with the ME 109 with regards to performance and firepower. Kenley, late September 1941. Glenn Niven takes off along with the rest of the squadron on another endless sweep into northern France. As the Spitfires took to the air, many of the pilots wondered what lay ahead for them, especially the young replacements, some of whom were flying operationally for the first time, with only a few hours on Spitfires. Sadly for many of them, it would be their first and last operational flight. The 109s were no respecters of innocence.
The Battle of Britain wasn't too bad, because if you got shot down or shot up, you were 90% good chance of being over your own country. But the sweeps over the channel, you knew one bullet in the wrong place or one bit of shrapnel, and that was you either POW or killed. But so there was one, I think the last time when Al Deere was the CO, he was a hell of a man. Everybody would follow him to hell and back. And we were at about about 30,000 feet. And there was a hell of a rammy going on down below, about 15,000 feet. And I was section leader at the time. Yes. So that means I had 3 chaps behind me. And he said, "Oh, blue section, go down and sort things out." And so, yes sir, 3 bags full, sir. Down I charged to sort things out. When I get there, the other 3 had been shot down. And I sort of turned around and I saw what I thought was a Messerschmitt on fire. And then my brain, working like an absolute demon, decided he had 1 cannon and sort of 4 machine guns firing at me. Oh dear. So I thought, this chap's a bit hostile. Yes. And sort of did things and shot at him and he shot at me and we roared around. And then I came out at sort of probably 100 feet over the coast. And that was not nice at all, because all their guns opened up. And as you charged over the sea, you could see all the stuff, shrapnel, etc., dropping into the sea all around you. And that was a bit frightening. And then when you get back and find the other 3, because being over France, you see that you didn't know whether they were dead or wounded or POWs or what.
1942, and 602's next commanding officer was Paddy Finnegan. Only 21 years of age, he had amassed the same amount of kills, for which he had been awarded 3 DFCs and a DSO. A skilled and excellent fighter pilot, he was destined to lead Glasgow's own into many exciting battles as the sweeps continued. His courage and quiet Irish charm instilled inspiration in his pilots. But inspiration alone would not be enough, as a new menace appeared in the skies over France to challenge their fighting skills and their Spitfires. That threat had been in the shape of the formidable Focke-Wulf 190, powered by an enormous BMW radial engine, which gave it a top speed of over 400 miles per hour. It easily outclassed 602's Mark V Spitfires. And with its M17 machine guns and 20mm cannons, the balance of power had once again turned in favour of the enemy. The Spitfires of Fighter Command were quickly altered to gain maximum power and speed. This was accomplished by removing their wingtips to reduce drag and modifying their superchargers to improve overall performance. These modifications, however, only improved the fighter's capabilities at lower altitudes. Only the eventual introduction of the Mark IX Spitfire would fully redress the situation. However, the modified Spitfire, designated the LA-5, did have many successes against the Focke-Wulf 190. 1942 also saw the daring Channel dashed by 3 German battleships. 2 Spitfires of 602, piloted by Wing Commander Beamish and Finlay Boyd, now also a Wing Commander, were in the air on a low-level mission to France. En route over the Channel, they had first sighted the squadron of 109s, and then the ships in the calm waters below. Beamish and Boyd then began a furious attack on the enemy vessels, whilst raiding their position. But despite valiant attacks throughout that day by fleet air-armed torpedo bombers, the German battleships escaped into the open sea. That same cold stretch of sea also sadly claimed the life of Paddy Finnegan. Promoted to Wing Commander at just 21, the RAF's youngest ever, he was over France on yet another sweep, when under a sustained attack by enemy fighters, his Spitfire received a mortal hit to the Glasgow tank. Too low to bail out, he had nursed his dying aircraft out over the coast and ditched in the Channel. Tragically, both Finnegan and his Spitfire were lost to the ever-enveloping caresses of the sea. As the weeks of war passed into months and the months into years, 602 Squadron were posted to practically every fighter station in the length of Britain to keep apace with the ever-increasing attacks on Hitler's Fortress Europe. From the summer months of 1941 at Kenley, and later Red Hill, where many of the old faces began to disappear as promotion was followed by the inevitable transfer, these faces would change often throughout the long years that lay ahead, but not the prowess of Glasgow's own. (1942) also saw the squadron posted to 14 Group at Skibray in the Orkneys. 1943, and it was Lasham's turn to host 602. Then on to Bognor a few weeks later, where they flew countless escort missions to Mitchell and Boston bombers as the push into Europe intensified. 1944, Skibray, the specially prepared Spitfire 7 with its pressurised cockpit and extended wingtips and tail fin, took 602 once again into the history books in another daring first, as pilot Ian Blair, flying at 38,000 feet, successfully shot down an equally high-flying PR-109. The commanding officers who led 602 throughout those years are legendary: Pete Brothers, DSO, DFC, June to October 42, Mike Baytag, DFC, October 42 to October 43, and finally Max Sutherland, DFC, who would lead 602's 12 Spitfires over the beaches of Normandy as Operation Overlord finally began on the 6th of June 1944. D-Day plus 8 hours. 602 Squadron Spitfires head for Normandy, surrounded by over 10,000 aircraft of all types, of which 4,000 are fighters. Heading the enormous armada on that day was over 1,000 Dakota aircraft, some of which were towing Horsa gliders filled with infantry, whose task it was to secure the bridgeheads behind the enemy fortifications. In the calm waters below, the equally huge armada of American and British ships, over 6,000 strong of all types, steamed steadily towards their respective objectives. At the appointed hour, the guns opened fire on Hitler's Atlantic Wall over a 60-mile area. As the British landing craft headed for the beaches, each man was sharing the same fear, the moment that he would have to scramble onto the shoreline under a withering hail of enemy machine gun fire. The American landings had been equally hazardous, but one beach would forever live in infamy: Omaha. Pinned down almost immediately by accurate mortar machine gun fire, hundreds of men had fallen within yards of the landing barges. The total losses suffered by the American Army on D-Day was over 4,600. Almost all of these casualties occurred on the blood-stained beach that was Omaha. As the slaughter continued on the coastal assault areas, inland the countless squadrons of Fighter Command Spitfires swept in over the French countryside, passing over the hundreds of Allied gliders that now lay like broken toys. A section of 602 then began the type of attack which would become a deadly routine in the weeks ahead.
They were in support of the troops, as I think, not in close support. I think they were harrying troop movements and that sort of thing.
The combined might of RAF Bomber Command and the American 8th Air Force drove on towards their objectives, the German defences within the invasion beaches. Over 5,000 tons of high explosives had rained down from the Mitchell and Boston bombers over a broad front, spreading a swathe of carnage and destruction, which stunned the German defenders. In the weeks leading up to D-Day, the French Northern Railway system had been largely destroyed by continued bombing by Lancasters and B-17s in a prelude to the invasion. Between June 6 and June 12th, 12,000 operational sorties were flown by Fighter Command squadrons. This overwhelming air superiority had kept the once elite Luftwaffe pilots and their aircraft clear of the skies over the Allied invasion forces. Two Spitfires, piloted by Pierre Klosterman and Jacques Renlener of 602, hurtled earthwards to strike a patriotic blow for freedom at the faltering German Air Force. 1944 and a German staff car heads towards La Roche-Guyon.
They also happened to shoot up Rommel and turn him over up and injured him.
The legendary Desert Fox would never serve the Third Reich again. Involved in a July bomb plot to assassinate Hitler, he was given the alternative of either a public trial and execution or suicide. A few days later, it was announced that Erwin Rommel had died of his injuries. August 1944. Chris Leroux, 602's newest commanding officer, reported missing over the Channel. A courageous and spirited leader who had flown during the Battle of Britain and also against Rommel in Africa was tragically never seen or heard of again. Only a week after the Allied landings, Hitler's revenge weapon, the V-1 flying bomb, had begun to rain down on London. With a speed of over 400 miles per hour, they were a difficult and hazardous target for the Spitfires. The newly introduced Hawker Tempest, with a maximum speed of 436 miles per hour, would reduce the threat of the V-1, although shooting down a V-1 was never popular, as at 400 yards the target was too small, and at 200 yards the explosive effect could be fatal. The Gloucester Meteor, in squadron service from mid-1944 and with a top speed of 600 miles per hour, was one answer to the V-1 menace. The Mark 16 Spitfire was another, with its 1,000-pound bomb under the fuselage and two 250-pounders under each wing. It was a formidable dive bomber, a role that 602 Squadron, now back under command of Max Sutherland, had been perfecting since April 1944. Sutherland led many successful attacks against the V-1 launching sites. These attacks, combined with the rapid advance of the Allied armies, brought about the virtual end of the V-1 assault on Britain by September 1944. In the same month, a greater menace began to fall on London, the V-2, a giant liquid oxygen rocket weighing more than 11 tons. It carried a ton of explosive and, travelling at speeds of up to 4,000 miles per hour, it gave the recipients of its destruction little warning. Impossible to destroy by existing defences, the only answer lay in the destruction of the rocket bases and their launching sites. Tommy Love, more affectionately known as Cupid, recalls one such strike whilst flying with Raymond Baxter, when he attempted another 602 first.
We had already bombed, it was dive bombing, and you dive from 8,000 feet to about 2,000, and then pulled through. And just as I pulled through, we saw this, the V2 coming out, in the sort of black spiral. It must have been paraffin or something, burning. And before it shot out of sight, it was then I turned round and had a shot at it,
March 1945, Spitfires of 602 Squadron head out over the North Sea on a daring low-level strike at the heart of the V2 research establishment, the Potassium Mix building situated in The Hague. Despite heavy anti-aircraft fire, the target was totally destroyed by the cannon fire and bombs of 602's aircraft. Lancasters of Bomber Command drawn towards the target, Berlin. In their bomb base hang the 22,000-pound Tallboy. Better known as a Grand Slam, this 25-foot-long monster created on impact a crater 120 feet long and 35 feet deep. It was the beginning of the end for Germany's capital, as the sheer might of the Allied bombing reduced the once beautiful city to rubble, killing over 52,000 inhabitants and laying waste to over 10 square miles. In the early days of Hitler's rise to power, he had told the people of Berlin, "Give me 10 years and you won't recognize your city." Allied fighters roamed far and wide, attacking all modes of transport and means of communication. Now flying over 120 sorties a day, the hundreds of fighters spread a deadly trail of death and destruction to anything that moved. Brilliant Messerschmitt 262, this shark-like jet fighter was the Luftwaffe's last operational aircraft. Capable of speeds of over 600 miles per hour, it had easily outclassed all Allied fighter aircraft bar the Meteor. But it was too little, too late, as fuel shortages and the constant attacks on airfields brought about the inevitable grounding of all of Germany's aircraft. By April 1945, the once invincible Luftwaffe had all but ceased to exist. April had also saw the Allied armies reach the outskirts of Berlin itself, where they met fierce resistance from Germany's final line of defence. A combination of political and military reasons led to this final battle for Germany's capital, being fought by the Soviet armies, who were soon engaged in bitter street-to-street fighting as they pushed on into the centre of the city, taking hundreds of prisoners as the German Ninth Army collapsed. With the Russians now almost at his underground bunker, Hitler inspects all that was left of his 1,000-year Reich. A week later, he commits suicide. May 2nd, 1945. Germany surrenders, as does Göring. He would also escape justice by committing suicide. At 3 p.m. on the afternoon of the 2nd of May 1945, Soviet guns ceased to fire on Berlin. In the great enveloping silence that followed, Russian troops hoisted the red flag over the Reichstag. Along what was once Hitler's parade route, the Allies met and celebrated the ceasefire, but the cost of victory had been high. The Russians alone lost over 300,000 men in the battle for Berlin. In Britain, Winston Churchill walks amongst the people as they celebrate the return of peace. A week later, 602 Squadron were disbanded. For 6 years, they, like so many others, had fought long and hard. What now were the thoughts that it was finally all over?
I was very lucky. I was very lucky to survive. I was lucky in the friends I met. I was lucky in the places I went to. I was given a squadron to form, but I was very, very glad to get out of it. I was alive.
I joined the RAF for Glasgow zone, and I was very pleased that I managed to get there before hostilities and everything finished.
Looking back on it, had not a bad war.
The war to me was excitement, and I was young and I was flying the best aircraft, Spitfire. It looked good. It was a perfect lady.
Arkleston Cemetery, June 1949. The serenity of the dead is once again disturbed as 602 Squadron returned to the birthplace at Renfrew. Initially reformed at RANAS Abbotssinch in 1946, the move to Renfrew had been one of necessity as conditions at Abbotssinch had deteriorated to such an extent that all flying had been suspended. Marcus Robinson, who had taken command in 1946, was still at the helm. The reforming of 602 had attracted many new faces to Glasgow's elite squadron. One such face was Jack Forrest, seen here on the left of the picture, who would command 602 during 1952-1953. The faces of Bill Melling and Johnny Mitchell reflect the pride felt by this new breed of men who would uphold the traditions of Glasgow's own. From early 1947, the squadron then equipped with the Griffin-powered Mark 21 Spitfire were ready for business. Jim Johnson, DFC, who had flown Mosquitoes in the Far East during the war with 157, 681 and 684 squadrons, recalls an incident shortly after joining 602 in the summer of 1948, when Lady Luck smiled broadly.
I remember once flying a Spitfire. I was doing a low-level cross-country, about 600 feet, between here and Edinburgh coming back. And on the way back, my engine started playing up rough. So I gave out a mayday call and said I was over Court Bridge, which I was at that time. And then the flames started coming out the engine around the back of my head. So I had to make a landing. I was too low to bail out. I was scared to bail out. I never bailed out. I don't think I ever would. But there was this field. On one side there was houses, and the other side there was a brick kiln. And the field itself was filled with high tension pylons. So fortunately I missed this pylons all right. It made a bouncy landing, a wheels up landing. The plane was a right off. And it was ages before anybody came from 602. And apparently when I had said mayday over Court Bridge, they thought I said mayday over Forth Bridge. And they had the air-sea rescue out looking for me. So that explains the delay.
By 1951, the age of the piston-engine fighter was all but over, and in May of that year, 602 paid a sad farewell to the aircraft that had served them faithfully for 12 years. But for the pilots who had flown and fought in her, the name Spitfire would remain forever in their minds and hearts. Jack Daly had been one of those fortunate enough to have flown and known the legend. In late 1940s reflying with 611 Squadron, and whilst attacking a train near Sanamar, his aircraft came under sustained enemy fire. His Spitfire crippled, he had been forced to bail out. After many adventures in the company of the French resistance, he was eventually captured by the Gestapo and spent the remainder of the war as a POW. Jack joined 602 Squadron in early 1950 and remembers the transition from piston to jet-powered aircraft vividly.
Well, the Spitfire was a wonderful aircraft to fly right through the range from the beginning to the real heavy ones at the end. But when you moved on to vampires, the immediate impression, for me at least, was this wonderful feeling of relief from the great nose that you couldn't see past in a Spit to practically sitting out in space with nothing to interfere with visibility. Apart from that, the Vampire was a very, very easy aircraft to fly. It had no vices at all. In fact, it used to be called the Screaming Kiddie Car by some people.
The first difference strikes you the noise. In a Spitfire, the noise was with you all the time. You know, on the ground and taking off. Whereas a jet, the noise on the ground was I think louder, but once you took off, you didn't hear it so much. The engine was behind you. It's much easier to fly. There was no torque when you took off. With the Spitfire, the big metal engine, the propeller going one way, it's like a top, a gyro top. The plane tend to go with the propeller. With a jet, you had nothing like that. It was a very, very easy plane to fly. There was no bad habits at all. It was nice.
1951 had also saw another change of commanding officer for 602. Squadron leader Harbone Stephen, DSO DFC in Bar, who had flown with distinction during the war and who would now guide Glasgow's own through the early days of jet-powered flight. Another aircraft which equipped the squadron then was the Meteor 7. These aircraft were used for general duties, drogue towing and also instrument flying tests, where the pilot under test sat in the enclosed rear cockpit, flying solely on his instruments. Jack Daly was one such pilot who performed this fundamental flying test.
I see from my log there that I flew a Meteor 7 on the 18th of February, that's 1951. Subsequently straight on to Vampires, which was our standard aircraft.
In that same year, along with all other auxiliary squadrons, 602 were mobilised as international tension increased as the Korean situation worsened. From Renfrew they were sent to RAF Lookers, where alongside 222 and 43 Squadron they began an intensive 3-month training course. They were soon to make their mark, as the reliability of the Vampire was put to the test in the skillful hands of Jack Daly.
During our call-out for the Korean War, June 1951, we had, the Vampires were fairly new to us, and nobody quite knew what would happen if you've got an engine failure. We had a lot of argument about it, and of course the first person it happened to was me. It was downwind at Lookers, just about to put the wheels down, and the engine suddenly quietly faded away. And as there was another aircraft on the runway, I had to do a belly landing on the grass. Well, much to my surprise, the thing flew like a glider. It was absolutely perfect. It was easy. And if I hadn't hit a taxi track, there'd have been no damage at all. As it was, there was one bulkhead broken.
Wilson Galloway, who during the hostilities had flown with 289 Squadron, joined 602 in early 1952. An enthusiastic cine-camera buff, he shot this remarkable colour film of Glasgow's own at work and play. The shrill of the pipes echo across an RAF base in the south as during one of 602's annual camps the squadron band practised. In the warm summer sun the men off duty relaxed. One of those men was Glenn Niven, one of the few who returned to 602 in 1948. Another was Alec Bowman, who during war service had flown Spitfires and Mustangs with 154 and 234 squadrons. He joined Glasgow's elite in the summer of 1950. The smooth running of any squadron was dependent not only on the skill of its pilots, but also the dedication of the ground crews. 602 Squadron were no different in this respect, a fact that all the pilots agreed on.
Let's face it, without the ground crew, there was no Air Force. They were very dedicated. In fact, I think they were more dedicated than the air crew. Because we could take a weekend off, but I don't think they were allowed to. Especially auxiliary, they were paid peanuts, and the things they must have given up. I mean, there was no Saturday or Sunday football for them, or going to the dogs or anything like that. They had to go and service our aircraft.
As far as I was concerned, we were all members of 602 Squadron. Some of us were pilots and some of us were ground crew. Neither could perform their particular task without the other, and they did a wonderful job for us.
How they stuck it, I don't know. I mean, they're out there in all weather. I mean, if it were raining, we wouldn't fly, but they'd still go in the hangar and repair all the aircraft. And because the regulars, they were the professionals. I admired them very much. I can't remember one incident that you could say it was a rigger or a fitter's fault of an aircraft crashing.
Squadron Leader Bert Davidson, DFC, took over command from Jack Forrest in late 1953. He would lead 602 for the next 3 years, but time was running out for Renfrew. Extensive expansion work on the civilian terminal had already forced the squadron to move back to their original dispersal areas, and in the summer of 1954 it was decided that they would return to RNS Abbotssinch. And so, as they had 3 years earlier when they bade a sad farewell to their beloved Spitfires, 602's pilots now said an equally sad farewell to the birthplace of Glasgow's own. Annual camp that year had been at RAF Pembrey, where Wilson Dalloway shot this unique film of the squadron's vampires on exercise over the Bristol Channel. A few short months later, on a dreary winter's evening, near disaster was to strike at 602 Squadron.
We did a late evening trip, 6 of us, in line astern. We were climbing through clouds. We got to the top of the clouds, and apparently the visibility came down rather rapidly on the airfield. So we were recalled. When I saw the runway lights, they were shimmering, just like the lights you see through the windscreen of a motor car when it's raining, with the windscreen wipers not working. Anyway, I must have hit the beginning of the runway with my nose wheel, because a shower of sparks came up. I didn't see them, but they told me later on. But I knew something had happened, so I pulled the nose back, kept the nose up in the air, and got along the runway as long as I could. So I swerved off the runway, and unfortunately there was a concrete post about 20-30 yards off the runway, which I again hit with my nose wheel. So that plane was kaput.
It was gay dark by this time. I would think it would be about 5:15, and as you can imagine, 5:15 in a bleak November night wasn't pleasant. When I came in, because of ice on the aircraft screen, it wasn't very easy to see. I understand Jim Johnson had the same problem ahead of us. I knew I didn't have enough runway to take off again, and I prepared to ground loop.
He passed me, I think he must have been doing about 60 miles an hour, going sideways. So he hit the end of the runway, went up the embankment at Abbotssinch, through the wire fence, and onto the main road. But this time the CO who was in the distant hut, he came up from his wagon, saw I was okay. So we decided to go and warn the traffic on the road, because there was a bus on one side, and there was a few cars on the other side. And this engine was blowing huge chunks of metal, of road metal, all over the place. Anyway, I got into the bus, and I told the driver to reverse because the plane might explode. But all the passengers were lying on the floor. And I remember he said to me, he said, "Are you all right, son?" I said, "I'm all right. That's not my plane. My plane's lying in bits over there. This is East Galloway's." And H was still in his plane. And it's funny, it shows you how heroic you are. You started running towards him and shouting, "Get out, Edith, get out." Then you started slowing down, then you started walking. But he was trying to stop the engine all the bloody time, but he couldn't do it. But eventually it stopped itself. Actually, the engine expanded 1.5 inches with the heat. And that was, I think, a 4 feet hole in the ground.
Before that year was over, Jim Johnson was to experience once again the fickle hand of fate, as yet another near disaster was avoided by the timely intervention of Lady Luck.
Remember, we were doing air firing, and normally we test our guns. We're going to the squadron, so we went from line astern into Ashland Port, and you face out towards the sea just to test your guns. To test your guns, you have a wee panel which you raise first of all, and then the gun button's below that. Then you press the gun button. However, when I raised the panel, the gun started firing without pressing the button. So I was thinking, when we were line astern, if I'd raised that panel, I would have wiped out 602 Squadron. I was the last man and they were all in front of me. So
1956. Annual camp for 602 that year had been at RAF North Front Gibraltar, where the Vampire's maximum flying time was tested to the very edge of its limits. As on arrival after the 2-hour flight from Marseille, many of the aircraft, now dangerously low in fuel, had landed without first doing a circuit of the airfield. However, in true 602 fashion, everyone got down safely. At Abbotssinch, an event of much more significance occurred that year, the presentation of the Cooper Trophy to the top Royal Auxiliary Air Force Squadron. Squadron leader Don Bartman, 602's latest and last commanding officer, stands proudly in front of 602 Squadron, who won that prestigious award in the summer of 1956. The presentation of the trophy was carried out by 602's Honorary Air Commodore, His Grace the Duke of Hamilton. As the men paraded proudly that day, little did they know that in a few short months they would march once again. Sadly then, it would be for the final time, as in January 1957, a signal received was relayed to the men of 602 Squadron, which read, as effect, March 1957, all squadrons of the Royal Auxiliary Air Force to be disbanded. In this final picture, taken at Abbotssinch, the smiles of the men masked their true feelings. Many felt they still had much to give to 602 Squadron, but political nearsightedness had robbed them forever of their ambitions. And so after over 30 years of existence, 602 Squadron slipped quietly into the annals of history. The royal standard which bears all of the squadron's battle honours now resides in Glasgow Cathedral, assuring that the deeds of Glasgow's own are forever remembered. In 1983 saw the long overdue opening of this fine museum, dedicated entirely to the history and achievements of 602 Squadron. The brainchild of 2175 Rolls-Royce Squadron's ex-commanding officer Bill McConnell, whose determination saw the museum constructed within 14 months. A credit also to the cadets of 2175 and the many organisations and friends who willingly give their time and resources. The many visitors to the museum can view the entire history of the squadron from their early beginnings in 1925 through the troubled 30s to the Second World War. An exhibit of interest is the one shown here, which contains artefacts from the downed Humby Hankel, which fell to the guns of Archie McKellar in 1939. It is worth noting that such was Archie's skill as a fighter pilot, that on one occasion he was credited with the destruction of 3 enemy aircraft with a single burst of fire. He then went on to distinguish himself in the Battle of Britain, shooting down a total of 16 enemy aircraft. Sadly, like so many others, he finally paid the ultimate price for his bravery. The cadets of 2175 Squadron take immense pride in the upkeep of the museum and will gladly answer questions from interested visitors, old and young alike. A model of the immortal Spitfire bearing the squadron's identification letters LO looks down on a group of visitors as they take in the atmosphere of their historical surroundings. On certain days, some of the men who served with 602 during its heyday can be seen lending their own brand of expertise at the museum. Bert Simpson and Glenn Niven, once friends in arms, now friends for life, talk and gaze nostalgically at the many photographs of the aircraft that above all others will remain synonymous with Glasgow's own.
Spitfire is the most beautiful machine that's ever been made and ever will be made.
There was a perfect lady